In the middle of a crowded park, no one stepped in when three spoiled rich kids pinned a woman's wheelchair and kicked the service dog, trying to shield her. People watched, some even filmed. But when the second kick cracked against the dog's ribs, drawing a painful cry, a lone runner suddenly changed course. He didn't yell, he didn't warn.
Oh my God.
He simply stepped silently between them. And from that moment on, nothing was ever the same. Parfley. The heat over Oceanside Pier Park didn't blaze, it clung. Late sun hung low over the water, turning the waves copper as they rolled in under the wooden pier. On a stretch of grass near the boardwalk, a worn sketchbook rested across a woman's lap, her wheelchair angled to catch the light. At her feet, a golden dog lay stretched out, ears twitching at every sound. His name was Scout. His vest, folded neatly over the back of the chair, read Service Dog, but he didn't need letters to know his job. Every shift of Rachel's breathing, every tiny tremor in her hands, flickered through him like a signal. He watched the world the way a bodyguard watches a crowd, nose working, eyes bright, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. For a moment, life was simple. Kids on skateboards rattled along the concrete path. A jogger thudded past with music leaking from his earbuds. Gulls screamed over French fries. Someone dropped near the benches. Rachel's pencil whispered over the page, catching the curve of the pier and the shimmer where the sunlight broke on the water. Scout's tail thumped once, lazy, each time a breeze brought the salty tang of the ocean. People passed by and looked, some at the wheelchair, some at the dog, some at the drawing. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve and asked if he could pet the pretty golden dog. And Rachel smiled, explaining gently that Scout was working. Scout watched the boy with soft eyes, ears tipped forward, then relaxed when they moved on. He lived in that space between alert and at ease, always half a breath from action. The piece didn't shatter all at once. It started with a bass line, a low thump that didn't belong to the ocean or the city. A white SUV slid into a spot along the curb, paint so clean it reflected the palm trees. The music bled out before the doors even opened. 3 teenagers spilled onto the sidewalk in a mess of designer sneakers, sunglasses, and phones held high like they were more important than air. Scout's head lifted before Rachel even looked up. His ears pricked and his body tightened, not in fear, but in calculation. The tall one in the middle walked like every step was for an audience. Mason Carter. On his left, Jace lumbered along, broad and eager. On his right, Brianna lagged half a step behind, phone already recording, her laugh just a little too loud to sound real. They didn't head for the water or the ice cream stand or the skateboarders. Their eyes found the same easy target that bullies always did: wheels and a dog. Mason's grin flicked sharp when he saw the wheelchair. "Yo, check out this service dog," he said, just loud enough to carry. "Bet he's just a prop." Jace snorted. Brianna angled her phone, framing Rachel and Scout in a vertical rectangle. Rachel's hand tightened around her pencil. Scout moved without a word, rising from his lazy sprawl to sit between her and the approaching trio, body a solid line. His tail no longer wagged. His gaze locked on Mason's shoes, then his face, reading his energy the way he'd been trained. The fur along his shoulders rippled, but his mouth stayed closed. No growl, just a vibration building low in his chest. "Hey, golden boy," Mason cooed, flicking his fingers like calling a pet. "Do a trick for the camera." He grabbed a fry from a nearby trash can lid, tossed it toward Scout's paws. The dog didn't move. His head stayed high, eyes fixed forward. Rachel finally spoke, voice steady, even though her pulse skipped. "He's a service dog. Please don't distract him. We're fine here." The words should have been enough. They never were, with kids like this. Mason stepped closer, planting himself in front of Rachel's chair, blocking her view of the pier. Jace drifted behind, one hand falling casually on the push handles of the wheelchair. The motion was small, but the effect was not. When Rachel tried to roll back, the chair didn't move. Her stomach dipped. Scout leaned forward a fraction, muscles coiled. Brianna's phone hovered, catching all of it. The wheelchair pinned in place, the dog sitting like a golden shield. "Relax," Mason said, fake charm sliding over his words. "We're just joking. If the dog's real, he won't mind a little test." His sneaker nudged closer to Scout's front paw, tapping the grass. Scout's nostrils flared. He shifted to keep his body between Mason and Rachel, chest tense, eyes no longer soft. For a heartbeat, everything balanced on a knife edge. The breeze carried the laughter from a group by the rail, the crash of waves, the far-off cry of a gull. Scout felt Rachel's breath snag behind him, a tiny stutter that shot down his spine like lightning. His training screamed restraint. His instincts screamed move. Mason's grin stretched wider, and he drew his foot back just enough to make it a choice. Then the choice was gone. Mason's kick came fast and mean, his shoe slamming into Scout's ribs with a crack of contact that cut straight through the park's lazy hum. Pain exploded along the dog's side, white-hot and shocking. Scout yelped, the sound torn from him, legs scrambling as he stumbled sideways into the grass. Rachel's scream tore free a second later, raw and useless, hands gripping her wheels that still wouldn't turn. For Scout, the world narrowed to three things: the burn along his side, Rachel's voice trembling behind him, and the shapes in front of him that smelled like cheap cologne, and cruelty. He tried to stand fully, chest heaving, one paw digging into the dirt to anchor himself. Mason drew his foot back again, laughter leaking out of him like this was the best content he'd filmed all week. Jace's fingers tightened on the chair handles. No one stepped in. People watched from a safe distance, phones up, brows furrowed, waiting to see if this became the kind of story they could talk about over dinner. The sun caught on Scout's fur as he forced himself back between Rachel and the boy who hurt him, shoulders low, breath rattling. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't break training. He just stood there, hurting and unshakable, because that was what he knew how to do. And then, quietly, something shifted. A shadow stretched across the grass, long and solid, cutting between Rachel's chair and the three rich kids like a drawn line. Footsteps had been moving toward them for some time, steady and unhurried, but no one on that patch of lawn had noticed. The shadow stopped, centered itself, and the air around them thinned as a man in a sweat-darkened t-shirt came to a halt, silent, and suddenly there. Logan had been running long enough that the pier and the noise had faded into one soft blur. His world was breath in, breath out, the slap of his shoes on the path, the salty air burning a little at the back of his throat. He didn't wear headphones. Years of training had wired something into him. If you can't hear the world, you can't see the danger coming. That was why the first thing that sliced through his rhythm wasn't the scream. It was the yelp, a dog's cry, high and strangled, full of pain in a way no training bark ever was. His body reacted before his mind named it. Shoulders rolled forward, stride lengthened, eyes already scanning ahead. When the woman's voice followed a heartbeat later, broken and pleading, he was already off the path. From where he came in, the scene was a snapshot, a wheelchair pinned by a big kid's hands, a pale girl with her mouth open around a scream, a golden dog stumbling in the grass with his side caved in where a shoe had hit. Three rich kids in a loose triangle, phones out, mouths curled. Logan didn't shout. Warnings were gifts for people who deserved them. These didn't. Scout didn't see a hero when he looked up. He saw motion, a new shape cutting into the space between Rachel and the threat. His ribs screamed, each breath a hot stab, but his mind stayed clear enough to register the man's smell. Sweat, salt, something metallic and clean that reminded him of kennels and training grounds. The dog's tail twitched once, confused, then stilled as the stranger moved. Logan hit Jace first. The kid's hands were on the wheelchair handles, so they were his priority. A quick step behind, an arm looped under the chin, pressured just right, and the boy's grip fell away as his knees buckled. Logan turned with the motion, letting him drop gently to the grass. Scout watched it, all through a haze, recognizing the fluid efficiency even if he didn't have words for it. Mason barely had time to swear before Logan was there. No wind-up, no Hollywood punch. Just a palm to the chest, a sweep of the leg, and Mason's back slapped the ground hard enough to knock the air out of him. The boy's phone flew from his hand, skittering across the grass. For the first time, the laughter stopped. Brianna's camera shook, the frame catching Scout's heaving sides. For the dog, the world shifted again. The pressure on Rachel's chair was gone. The boy who had hurt him was on the ground, gasping, eyes wide. The new man didn't smell afraid. He smelled like storms held on a leash. Logan's gaze flicked from Mason to Scout, lingering for half a second on the dog's uneven breathing, the tremor in his front leg as he tried to stand taller. "Stay," Logan said quietly, not to Mason, but to Scout, voice pitched low and certain. It wasn't the word itself the dog understood, so much as the tone, the calm in it. His training met that calm and locked onto it like a hand to a rope. Scout froze where he stood, ribs sawing, but his feet planted. Rachel's hand found the back of his neck, fingers burying in his fur, like she was anchoring herself. Sirens didn't come right away. They never did. Logan had already dialed before Mason sucked in his second full breath. His report was clipped, factual. Woman in a wheelchair, service dog kicked, minors involved, no weapons seen. As he spoke, Scout's ears flicked at the sound of the distant wail growing closer, something in him relaxing at the familiar tone of help approaching, even through the pain. When the black and white rolled up, Scout flinched at the flash of lights, startled by the stab of red and blue over the water. A middle-aged officer with a deep tan and tired eyes stepped out, squinting. Harlan Briggs. He took in the wheelchair, the crying woman, the dog's labored breathing, then his gaze snagged on Mason. Recognition shifted his whole posture, shoulders loosening just a hair. Briggs listened to Rachel's rushed account, halfway, eyes darting between her and Mason. Logan saw the moment the scales tipped, when the boy said his last name, Carter, and the officer's jaw twitched. The report on his notepad grew thin. Scout didn't know names or politics. He only knew Rachel's scent when she realized she wasn't being believed. It turned sharp with fear and humiliation, and that cut him deeper than the kick. A second vehicle arrived, this one marked for animal control and emergency vet transport. A woman in scrubs knelt in front of Scout, moving with that same careful confidence Logan had used. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, hands hovering before touching his side. He winced but didn't pull away, eyes flicking to Rachel. Her hand on his collar trembled. He leaned into it, telling her he'd go if she needed him to. They lifted him onto a low stretcher, thick blanket under. His body. Every bump hurt, but gentle hands steadied him. As they loaded him into the back, Scout saw Rachel's face over the edge, eyes red, lips pressed tight. The strange man, the one who had dropped from nowhere, stood beside her chair, broad shoulders blocking the kids from view. Scout's last clear thought before the van door closed was simple. Between her and danger, there was finally someone else. The drive to the clinic was a blur of engine noise and antiseptic smell. Rachel rode up front, twisting every few seconds to look back through the small window at his rise and fall. At one point, the tech adjusted the oxygen near his muzzle, and Scout caught a faint trace of that same metallic clean scent he'd noticed on Logan. Different source, same feeling, structure, safety, a world that made sense. For the first time since the kick landed, his breathing eased just a little. The exam room at the emergency clinic was quiet in a way parks never were. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, soft and distant. Scout lay on a padded mat while the vet's hands moved gently along his ribs. Each press sent a dull ache through his side, but the touch was careful, almost apologetic. He watched the man's face, reading concern in the furrow of his brow. Rachel sat close enough that her knee nearly touched his shoulder. Her chair was pulled right up to the mat, one hand resting in the thick fur of his neck. Her thumb kept making the same small circle, over and over, the way it did on the worst nights after bad dreams. Scout could feel her breathing, shallow and jittery, and he tried to steady his own to give her something calm to borrow. Dr. Patel spoke in that even, practiced tone people used when they knew someone was scared. "He's a tough boy," he said, tracing the edge of one rib. "Bad bruising for sure. We'll x-ray to check for fractures. His lungs sound clear right now. That's the good news." Rachel nodded, but Scout heard the word fractures more than good. Her fingers tightened. They slid a flat board beneath him and lifted. The motion tugged at the bruised muscles along his side, and he couldn't stop a low whine from slipping out. The tech murmured, "I've got you, buddy," like Logan had, and Scout decided to believe her. The x-ray room smelled of metal and old dust. For a few seconds, he had to lie completely still while machines clicked and hummed around him, like a storm made of light instead of sound. When they brought him back, Rachel was staring at her phone, face pale in the screen glow. Scout could sense it before he saw it. The way her shoulders hunched, the way her scent turned from sharp fear to something colder, like disappointment and shame. She tried to smooth her features when the tech rolled him in, but dogs aren't fooled by faces. They listen to hearts and hands. On the phone, a video looped without sound. Scout caught flashes of his own body, frame frozen mid-bark, teeth just visible as he'd stepped in front of the strangers at the park. The clip cut off before the kick, before the yelp. Over the image were words Rachel didn't read aloud. "Aggressive service dog attacks kids at Oceanside." Comments were already piling up like trash at high tide. To Scout, it was just a flicker of his own shape on a bright square. To Rachel, it was a verdict. People who hadn't smelled the fear, hadn't heard the scream, were already choosing sides. Her thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling, then stopped when Dr. Patel came back in, holding the x-ray films. Scout watched her tuck the phone away, as if hiding a wound she couldn't show anyone. 3 cracked ribs, the vet said gently, holding the film up to the light. No punctured lung, which is a blessing. Pain meds, strict rest, no stairs, no jumping. He's going to hurt for a while, but with care, he should heal. Rachel let out a shaky breath that wasn't quite relief. Scout didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the way a storm sometimes broke without raining. They settled him into a kennel with a thick blanket and a soft cone he promptly squinted at in mild insult. Rachel reached through the bars, pressing her forehead to the metal. "I'll be back in the morning," she whispered. Scout pushed his nose to her fingers, breathing her in, trying to memorize the moment in case the world shifted again while he slept. He hated being anywhere she wasn't, but he knew that voice. "I don't want to leave you, but I have to." Back in her van, the quiet hummed like a held breath. The phone rang on the passenger seat, an unknown number with a local area code. Scout wasn't there to hear the smooth voice that introduced itself as Daniel Price, counsel for the Carter family, or the way Rachel's pulse jumped at the name. He wasn't there when the lawyer offered to pay every cent of his vet bills as a gesture of goodwill, if she would just sign and stay silent. What Scout would have understood if he'd been listening was the moment the offer turned into a threat. Rachel's fingers dug into the steering wheel as Daniel mentioned her landlord by name, her teaching work at the community art center, the possibility of unfortunate fallout if she kept pursuing this narrative. His tone never rose. Bullets don't have to be allowed to kill something. Something in Rachel's chest cracked that the x-ray couldn't show. At the clinic, Night settled in layers. The barking from other dogs faded as sedation and exhaustion pulled them under. Scout lay curled on his blanket, cone awkward around his neck, side throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Every so often, his ears twitched toward the door, waiting for the sound of wheels and a familiar perfume. Instead, he heard only distant phones, muffled human voices, and the soft click of keyboards in the office down the hall. He didn't know about lawyers or viral videos or men with last names that changed outcomes. He only knew that earlier that day, when everything went wrong, he had put his body between Rachel and harm, because that was the promise he'd learned before he ever met her. Now, aching and alone in a too-bright kennel, he did the only other thing he knew how to do for her from a distance. He rested. He healed, because sooner or later she would need him to stand up again. Morning at the clinic came without a sunrise. Scout knew it only because the hallway sounds changed. Night voices gave way to new footsteps, different coffee smells, the rattle of carts and metal bowls. His ribs still ached, a deep, nagging throb every time he shifted, but the fog in his head had thinned. He lifted his nose to the kennel door, sniffing for the one scent that mattered most. He caught traces of her everywhere. Rachel's smell clung faintly to the blanket they'd tucked around him, to the collar buckled under the edge of his cone. It was in the cuff of the Tekka's sleeve when she reached in to refresh his water, a brush of familiarity that made his tail give a hopeful, slow wag. He searched the air anyway, just in case she was closer than he thought, somewhere in the lobby, rolling toward him. At the same time, across town, Rachel was rolling herself up the wide ramp into the Community Art Center, palms working the wheels like muscle memory. She had told Scout she'd be back first thing after checking on her class space. If he'd been beside her, he would have felt the strain in her shoulders, the way she paused at every doorway like bracing for impact. Instead, all he could feel was the empty space where her hands usually settled on his harness. From his kennel, he could hear other dogs coming and going, their leashes jingling, their paws scrabbling on tile. Some went home with their people, voices high with relief. That sound hurt worse than his ribs. Each time he heard a collar clip, Scout's ears perked, then sank when the footsteps faded past his door. He didn't know the word overnight, but his body understood waiting. It settled into his bones like a second wait. When Rachel reached the hallway that led to her studio space, she knew something was wrong before she saw it. The smell hit first, sharp and chemical, a punch of spray paint over the usual mix of turpentine and paper. If Scout had been there, he would have sneezed, lip curling at the harsh edge of it. She pushed forward anyway, wheels squeaking on the scuffed linoleum, and turned the corner into what used to be her classroom. The room looked like a storm had targeted only her. Easels splintered, canvases slashed in long, cruel lines, jars of bright pigment exploded against the walls, like someone had thrown color grenades just to watch them burst. Where her big planning board once hung, the white space was soaked in dripping red letters. If Scout had been there, his body would have moved before his mind, planting himself between her and the destruction, as if he could block the sight itself. The words were simple and ugly. Next time, it's the dog. Rachel stared at them until the letters blurred. Her hand slid off her wheel, hanging limp at her side. Somewhere in the hallway, Mrs. Alvarez's voice broke on a gasp, then quiet Spanish prayers spilled out, soft and helpless. Scout wasn't there to hear them, but if he had been, he would have recognized the tone. Humans prayed the way hurt animals breathed through pain. Back at the clinic, Scout shifted, restless, claws ticking lightly on the plastic floor of his kennel. He didn't know about threats on walls or boys with spray paint, but he knew unease. It rode the air like a low hum. The tech who checked his chart had a tightness around her mouth now, an edge to her movements. She stroked his head without really looking at him, her mind elsewhere. Scout pressed his chin into her palm anyway, taking what comfort he could. The vet stopped by mid-morning, crouching to eye level. "How's our hero?" he murmured, checking the bandage around Scout's middle. The word wasn't one Scout understood, but the warmth beneath it made his tail tap the mat twice. Still, when the vet straightened and walked away, speaking in a low voice at the nurse's station about the woman from yesterday and a break-in at her work, the dog's ears tipped toward the sound. He caught her name. That was enough to make his heart beat faster. In the ruined art room, Rachel finally reached for her phone with numb fingers. A small hand touched her wheel before she could dial. Lily, one of her youngest students, stood in the doorway, holding a sketchpad pressed to her chest, eyes wide and wet. "Miss Rachel, where's Scout?" she whispered. The question sliced cleaner than any lawyer's threat. Rachel swallowed hard and managed, "He's resting at the doctor's. He's brave. He'll be okay?" Scout, miles away, felt a phantom pressure on his harness where Lily's hand usually landed when Rachel let her say hello. He gave a faint, questioning whine toward the door. A nurse passing by paused, misreading it as pain, and adjusted his blanket. The gesture helped, but only a little. His body hurt. His body could heal. It was the not knowing that made him pace in the small space, turning carefully so the cone didn't bump the walls. When Rachel finally called Logan, her voice was flat, more ash than flame. She described the wall, the words, the way someone had torn apart not just her supplies, but her students' work. On the other end of the line, Logan listened in silence long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "They wrote about Scout?" he asked at last, voice low. "By name?" She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "They wrote the dog," she said. They knew exactly where to hit. The decision that took shape in Logan's mind in that moment would change more than Rachel's day. But Scout didn't know about plans or traps yet. All he knew, as afternoon stretched thin and the clinic lights buzzed overhead, was that something out there had reached for his person again. So he did the only thing he could from behind the steel and glass. He stayed awake as long as his body allowed, ears tuned to every footstep, ready to rise the moment her scent finally came back through that door. Logan didn't like waiting rooms. They were too still, too full of old magazines and bad coffee, and people trying not to listen to each other's fear. The emergency clinic's lobby was no different, except for one thing. Behind the closed door to the back, he could hear the faint shuffle of paws, the soft clink of metal bowls. One of those sounds belonged to the dog he'd seen stand up through a kick. When Dr. Patel finally pushed through the swinging door, Scout was at his side. The Golden moved carefully, bandage snug around his ribcage, cone gone now, eyes a little glassy from meds. Even doped, he scanned the room before he stepped forward. His gaze hit Rachel's empty chair, then caught Logan's shape instead. His ears tipped, uncertain, but his tail gave one slow, hopeful wag. Logan knelt to meet him halfway. Up close, the damage was clearer, the hitch in Scout's breathing, the flinch when fingers brushed the wrong spot. "Easy, buddy," he murmured, palm flat against the dog's neck, feeling the pulse there. Scout leaned in, testing his weight against this new anchor. The man smelled like he had at the park. Sweat, cotton, and that strange, disciplined calm that dogs recognize even when humans don't. Paperwork signed, instructions folded into his pocket, Logan led Scout out to the parking lot. The dog stepped into the van like he'd done it 1,000 times, front paws first, then a slow, careful hop with the back. Every jolt on the short drive made his ribs complain, but Rachel's scent clung to the seat and the blanket Logan spread out for him. Scout lowered himself onto it with a sigh, nose pressed to the faded fabric where her hand had once rested. The motel sat just off the highway, long and low, with peeling paint and a soda machine that rattled every few minutes. The kind of place truckers and tired families used for one night and then forgot. Logan carried their overnight bag. Scout walked under his own power, each step deliberate. Outside the room door, he paused. Rachel's smell floated out from under the threshold, sharper now with worry and stale air. His tail lifted higher. When the door opened, the room shrank to a narrow tunnel. Bedspread, curtains, muted TV, all blurred at the edges. In the center of it sat Rachel's wheelchair. Her hand covered her mouth, eyes bright and wet. "Hey, Scout," she whispered, voice cracking on the second syllable. She reached out as he stepped forward. Pain tugged at his side, but he closed the distance anyway, pressing his head into her palm like he'd been trying to do since the park. He didn't jump or climb. He knew better. He settled beside her chair, leaning gently against her leg, letting her hands move over his ears, his neck, carefully avoiding the bandage. Her tears fell into his fur, and he didn't flinch. For Scout, the room stopped spinning. Bed, TV, Logan moving around with quiet purpose. None of it mattered as much as the familiar heartbeat just above him, the steadying rhythm he'd missed through steel bars and clinic walls. While Rachel held on to Scout, Logan walked the perimeter of the small room, eyes tracing locks, hinges, windows. He anchored a wedge under the door, checked the flimsy chain twice, then set a small gray alarm box near the jamb. Scout watched him through half-lidded eyes, ears flicking with each soft click of tape and metal. The dog didn't know what the devices were, only that the air around the man sharpened whenever he worked near entry points. A knock came later, a soft 3 count. Scout's head rose first, low rumble starting in his chest before Rachel could even turn her chair. Logan cracked the door, then opened it wider to let Mrs. Alvarez slip in, clutching a worn handbag and a small flash drive. She smelled like coffee, paint, and worry. Scout relaxed, muscles easing as her fingers brushed his head in passing. He knew her from the art center, the way she always patted his shoulder and called him Caballero. While Rachel and Mrs. Alvarez spoke in low voices about funding and threats and landlords, Logan plugged the drive into his laptop. Scout padded over and settled at his feet, chin on his boot. On the screen, silent footage flickered. 3 figures in hoodies slipping into the back of the art center, the smash of easels, the drag of canvases. Scout didn't understand pixels, but he recognized the shapes of violence, the jerky movements of people who hurt for fun. His ears pressed back, a quiet growl simmering under his breath. Across town, in a glass-walled office high above the water, another kind of planning was happening. Mason lounged in a leather chair, arm in a sling for dramatic effect, as his father and Daniel Price discussed damage control. The word dog kept coming up, along with phrases like liability and make it disappear. Scout would never smell that room, never hear the smooth way they folded cruelty into strategy, but the consequences of their talk were already rolling toward him. Back in the motel, the talk shifted. Rachel's voice was raw when she admitted she couldn't fight if everything she owned kept getting smashed. "They'll come again," Logan said quietly. "They've already told us how. They wrote it on the wall." His gaze dropped to Scout, who blinked up at him, chest rising in slow, careful breaths. "They want the dog. They think he's the easiest way to break you." The words made Rachel flinch like a physical blow. Her hand flew to Scout's collar. "You can't use him like that," she said, tears stinging fresh. Scout felt the jolt travel down her arm into his neck, sensed the fear spike in her scent. He pressed closer, ribs protesting, tail giving a small, confused tremor. To him, danger was something you walked into if it meant Rachel stayed safe, not something you debated around a cheap motel table. Logan sank to a crouch in front of Scout, resting one forearm on his knee. "He's not bait," he said softly, more to Rachel than the dog. "He's the proof. They've shown us what they're willing to do. We can either wait for them to choose the time and place, or we choose it for them, with him protected every second." His hand slid along Scout's shoulder, fingers gentle but steady. The dog met his eyes, reading resolve there, the same steady focus he'd seen at the park. night settled over the motel in a wash of distant traffic and buzzing neon. Scout curled up on the blanket between the two beds, close enough that if either Rachel or Logan reached down, their fingers would find warm fur. His ribs ached. His future held more trouble than he could imagine. But for that hour, he let his eyes close. The humans talked above him, voices low and serious, weaving plans around his sleeping form. He didn't know the details. He didn't need to. He only knew that wherever they went next, he would go too, because that was what dogs like him were made for, to stand in the middle of storms and call it home, as long as their people were there. The next day moved in slow, careful pieces. Scout rode in the back of the van again, this time not to a clinic, but to a quiet side street behind the Community Art Center. The building looked different in late afternoon, windows dark, doors locked, the laughter of children replaced by the distant hum of traffic. He stood in the open doorway of the van and sniffed. Paint, dust, and something else now. A sharp, sour edge of old fear. Logan didn't take him inside. Instead, he led Scout up a narrow metal stair to a second-floor office that overlooked the main hallway. The room was small, lined with filing cabinets and boxes, but it had what Logan wanted, a door with a solid lock and a view of the entrance below. He spread out another blanket in the corner and clipped a lightweight line to Scout's harness, more to remind the dog to stay than to restrain him. From that vantage point, Scout could see slices of the building through the office window. The wide hall, the shadowed doorway that led to Rachel's ruined classroom, the exit sign glowing dull red at the end. Logan moved like he did in the motel, checking every hinge and latch. He set small devices over the door frames, a camera near the stairwell, a phone on a stack of boxes with the lens aimed down the hall. Mrs. Alvarez arrived just before sunset, keys jangling, her steps brisk but uneven. She came up to the office, greeting Scout with a soft, "Hola, caballero," fingers finally finding that spot behind his ears that always made his eyes close. Halfway. He leaned into it for a heartbeat, then turned his attention back to the hall as she and Logan spoke. Words floated around him. Leaked schedule? Staff rumor? Sooner than we think. While she went back down to lock the front doors and forget to set one of the back alarms, Logan dimmed the office lights and sat on a metal chair by the window. Scout lay at his feet, ribs still wrapped, breath a little shallow but steady. The building settled around them, creaks and sighs he'd never noticed when it was full of kids and music. Now every sound felt louder, more pointed, like the walls themselves were listening. Across town, the white SUV rolled away from a waterfront restaurant, its passengers laughing too loudly. Scout couldn't hear the way Mason bragged about finishing what he started, or how Jace shifted uneasily in the back seat. He didn't see Brianna checking her phone over and over, thumb hovering above Logan's face in the park video before she closed it again. All Scout knew was that the air in the art center grew tighter as night came on. By the time true dark settled, the only light in the building came from the glowing exit signs and a flickering security bulb in the hallway. Logan checked his watch, then rested a hand briefly on Scout's neck. The dog stirred, ears pricking, catching the low murmur. Almost time. He didn't understand clocks, but he understood that tone, the one soldiers and handlers shared right before doors opened and things changed. The first hint they were no longer alone was a draft. Scout felt it slide under the office door, cool and thin, carrying a new scent. Cologne, cheap energy drink, the bite of spray paint that still lingered on clothes not yet washed. His head came up, nose working. A second later, through the cracked blinds, he saw a rectangle of deeper darkness as the back door eased open on the ground floor. 3 figures slipped inside, silhouettes against the faint street glow. One tall and swaggering, one broad-shouldered, one smaller, head bent over the glow of a phone. Their footsteps were too loud in the quiet hall, the careless stomp of people who believed the space belonged to them. Scout's chest rumbled low. Logan's hand dropped to his shoulder, a silent reminder to stay. The dog went still, but every muscle pulled toward the sounds below. Mason's voice floated up, hushed but still sharp. The old lady said she saw the chair back in there this afternoon. Dog's probably in some supply closet. Scout didn't know the words, but he knew the way they were said, like talking about an object, not a living thing. He pressed closer to the window, eyes tracking their phones as they cast jittery light over the broken art and splintered wood. Logan watched too, but not the way a frightened person watched. His gaze mapped paths and angles, noting how Jace drifted toward the ruined classroom while Mason headed for the back hallway door Mr. Carter's people had helpfully unlocked before. Brianna hesitated near a wall, her phone wavering over the red words she helped paint. Scout caught her scent even from above, nervous, sharp, not enjoying this as much as the boys. When Mason found the small utility room Mrs. Alvarez had once used to store easels, he yanked it open like expecting a dog to leap out. The space was empty, just old chairs and a mop bucket. His curse bounced off the walls. "She played us," he hissed. Beside Logan's boot, Scout's tail gave one hard thump at the empty room, a quiet, pained satisfaction. For once, the danger wasn't where they thought he'd be. That was Logan's moment. He reached over and clicked a small switch on the device beside him. Down below, the already weak hallway lights died completely, plunging the main floor into thick, heavy dark. Only the exit signs glowed now, red and distant, and the white squares of 3 phone screens jittered like frightened fireflies. In the office, Scout held his breath without knowing why, ears straining. The game had shifted. This time, his job was not to charge into the black, but to trust the man beside him, who moved like a storm with a leash in his own hands. From the office, the dark below looked almost soft, like water at night. Scout knew better. His ears tracked every shuffle of shoes on the tile, every nervous laugh bouncing off the empty walls. The glow from 3 phones bobbed through the hallway, thin islands of light in a sea of black. Beside him, Logan rose from the chair with the same quiet he used for breathing. Scout felt the change in him as much as he saw it. The man's body seemed to narrow, all loose edges gone, movements pared down to what was necessary. He bent once, brushing his fingers along Scout's neck. "Stay," he said, voice low but certain. The word landed on old training in the dog's mind, the same command that had held him steady by Rachel's bedside and in busy grocery aisles. Logan slipped out the office door, a shadow among shadows. Scout crept to the crack, nose pressed against the cool metal, listening. Below, Jace cursed as his phone bumped a chair, the clatter loud in the quiet. Mason hissed at him to shut up, his own voice higher now, bluster thinning. Brianna whispered that this felt wrong. Their fear carried up the stairwell, sharp and sour, chasing the earlier smell of cocky confidence away. The first impact came with a soft thud and a choked grunt. Scout's ears snapped forward. He couldn't see the move, but he could picture it. The same smooth grab and turn Logan had used in the park. Jace's heavy body hit the floor, air driven from his lungs. There was a scrape of plastic as a phone skidded, then the zip of something tightening, zip ties, binding wrists. Scout's chest rumbled faintly, not in threat, but in rough approval. Brianna's phone beam swung wildly, catching a flash of Logan's shoulder before he stepped aside again. Her breath hitched. "Mason," she whispered, voice cracking. "We should go." Below, Mason puffed himself up with a sound that wanted to be a laugh and ended as a thin, shaky exhale. "He's just one guy," he muttered. "I'm not scared of him." His heart, pounding hard enough for Scout to hear, told a different story. There was a pause, the kind that feels longer than it is. Scout shifted his weight, ribs tugging, muscles ready to move even though he'd been told not to. A moment later, Mason lunged. Scout heard the rush of his shoes, the whoosh of a clumsy swing with something heavy. Wood, maybe a broken easel leg. Logan's reply was short and ugly. Wood clattering, a strangled cry, the sound of a body dropping to one knee. Even from above, Scout heard the pain tear through Mason's voice. Not the smooth, practiced outrage from the park, but a raw, startled howl that said, for once, he wasn't in control. "My arm!" he yelped. "He broke my arm!" Logan's reply drifted up, even and cool. "It's not broken. You'll wish it was later if you don't stop." The dog didn't know the words, but he understood the balance in them. Warning, not gloating. Brianna began to sob, hiccuping apologies that bounced uselessly off tile and broken frames. The sound pulled at Scout in a different way. Pain, even in people who'd done wrong, never sat easy in him. His ears flattened, torn between his dislike of what she'd helped do and his instinct to lean into any hurt, offer warmth. He stayed where he was, claws digging into the floor, obeying the one human in the building who knew the whole picture. Then, at last, a sound Scout welcomed without reservation, the distant wail of sirens rising and falling like a promise. His tail thumped once against the office floor before he caught himself. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Inside, 3 phones lay scattered and useless, their owners now tied and breathing hard on the cold ground. Logan moved back toward the stairs, his steps unhurried again. Some invisible switch in him had flipped off. When the front doors banged open and flashlights cut through the dark, Scout flinched at the sudden glare. He backed away from the stairwell, nose working as new scents rolled in. Leather, gun oil, a trace of perfume on one of the officer's sleeves. Voices filled the hall, sharp and official. Another tone threaded through them a minute later, steadier, with a hint of tired patience. Detective Rhodes had arrived. Scout heard Logan's words rise and fall in simple statements. Trespassing, prior threats, video saved to the cloud. Mason's protests came louder, ragged with a kind of fear money didn't fix. "Call my dad. You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted. Scout lowered his head onto his paws at that, the sound grating. For once, people who wore badges weren't turning away. They were moving toward the mess, not around it. The hallway slowly filled with more light, more footsteps, the smell of pens on paper, and the dry click of handcuffs. Up in the office, the tension in Scout's body eased notch by notch. His world had shrunk that night to a narrow circle. Logan's scent, the rough weave of the blanket under his chest, the distant echo of Rachel's name in hushed voices. Now, with each new officer's arrival, that circle felt less fragile. By the time Logan climbed back up the stairs, Scout was standing, weight shifting carefully off his tender side. The man's face was drawn, but calm. He shut the office door behind him with a quiet click and let out a long breath he hadn't allowed himself downstairs. Scout stepped forward, pressing his head into Logan's hand. The worst of the storm had passed. They weren't done, not by a long shot. But for the first time since a shoe slammed into his ribs in a sunny park, the dog let himself believe that the tide might finally be turning their way. Chumbit. Morning at the art center didn't sound the same as it used to, but it was getting there. Instead of the hollow echo of boots and breaking wood, the halls carried the scrape of ladders, the buzz of paint rollers, and the murmur of volunteers. Scout trotted beside Rachel's chair at an easy pace, bandage long gone, fur grown back thick over the ribs that once bruised purple. His gait was still careful, but the spring had returned to it. The ruined classroom had been reborn. Fresh plaster covered the scars where canvases had been ripped away. Clean white stretched across the big front wall, waiting. Today, that blank space wouldn't be a threat in red letters. It would be a promise. Scout sat just inside the doorway, watching kids filter in with their sketchbooks, smelling crayons, new paint, and the sweet, nervous excitement of first days. Up near the front, a local news crew fussed with cables. Detective Rhodes stood off to the side in plain clothes, arms crossed, mouth softening each time she glanced at Scout. She'd been the one to scratch his head outside the station after the long night of statements, calling him officer with a smile that almost reached her eyes. He'd licked her knuckles once, sealing a quiet truce between them. The court dates had come and gone in a blur of suits and microphones. Scout had padded into the courthouse lobby between Rachel and Logan, nails clicking on the polished floor, ignoring the cameras that tried to catch his every move. He'd sat through endless hours on a blanket at Rachel's side, head resting on her lap as lawyers argued about videos the whole town had already seen. The gavel finally dropped, and for once the sound meant more than words. Guilty on all the counts that mattered. Mason's sentence didn't erase what had been done, but it carved something new into the town's memory. Community service, restitution to the art center, mandatory counseling, and a criminal record that even his father's money couldn't scrub clean. Jace took a plea and followed close behind. Brianna, shaking on the stand, had told the truth at last. When she passed Scout in the hallway afterward, she couldn't quite meet his eyes. He watched her go without a growl. Some lessons hurt worse than broken arms. Now, in the bright classroom, those legal storms felt far away. Mrs. Alvarez clapped her hands, calling the children to order. "Today," she announced, "we dedicate our new mural. This wall was once a message of fear. Now it will be a message of courage." She gestured to the scaffolding where a sketch already traced faint lines. A woman in a wheelchair appear in the distance, and at the center, a golden dog standing tall. Rachel rolled forward, Scout matching her exactly, his shoulder brushing her wheel. She spoke into the small microphone the center had dug out from some storage closet. Her voice still wobbled on certain words: attack, threats, being afraid to come to work. But it steadied when she talked about Scout stepping between her and the worst of it. Each time her hand drifted down to his head, fingers absently combing his fur. He leaned into the touch like it anchored them both. The kids listened with the wide-eyed seriousness only children can muster. Lily sat front and center, clutching a pencil, face set. When Rachel finished, she lifted a blank sheet and began to draw. Scout watched her, ears tipping forward. In a few sure lines, she sketched a dog much like him, planted between a small stick-figure child and a looming shadow. The proportions were all wrong, the feet too big, the ears a little crooked. It was perfect. Logan stood in the back, out of the camera frame, hands in his pockets. Scout knew he was there without looking. The man's scent, soap, coffee, a faint trace of machine oil from the range bag in his truck, threaded through the room. They didn't make a big moment of goodbye. No flag, no speech. Just a quiet morning a few days earlier at the motel when Logan had knelt, gripped Scout's muzzle gently, and said, "You keep watching her 6, okay?" The dog had answered with a firm, unhurried lick to his wrist. Now, as the first strokes of paint went up on the mural wall, Scout settled at Rachel's side and let his eyes half close. His chest rose and fell in an easy rhythm. No hitch, no hidden wince. Every so often a child would ask if they could pet him. Rachel would laugh and say, "He's on duty." But sometimes, when the kid's shoulders slumped, she'd give Scout a small nod. He'd shift an inch, offering a paw or a warm flank to lean against, always with one ear tuned to the door. Outside, Oceanside Pier Park went on the way it always had. Gulls yelling at the surf, joggers pacing the boardwalk, kids on skateboards carving lazy lines through the sunlight. Somewhere out there, other storms were brewing. Different bullies, different bystanders, different choices waiting to be made. Scout couldn't stop all of them. He was just one, dog with a few faded scars and a job he took too seriously. But in this small corner of the world, in this room that had once been a crime scene and was now a workshop, he had done what he was made to do. He had stood between hurt and the person he loved. He had taken the kick and still found a way to stand. As the mural slowly filled with color, a painted version of him taking shape under careful hands, the real Scout let out a long sigh and rested his head on Rachel's footrest. The message on the wall had changed. So had they. And for a long, quiet moment, that was enough. Stitu? If this story moved you, drop a simple 1 in the comments so I know you're here. Just a single number. That's all it takes. And if you want more true-hearted stories of courage, loyalty, and the dogs who stand by us even when the world doesn't, hit subscribe and stay with this community. Your support helps these stories keep going, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.